I was already dead when the human warship came down out of the smoke. That is how I have to begin, because it is the truth of how I felt, lying in the mud of the Korrun Flats with my line broken around me and the enemy advancing, and no part of me believing I would see another dawn. I was a dead soldier who had not yet stopped moving. And then the sky tore open above the battlefield, and the largest, most terrible machine I had ever seen descended through the smoke toward the killing, and every soldier on that field on both sides stopped. And in that stopping, in that silence, the war I had given my youth to ended, though it took me the rest of my life to understand how. My name is Davon Sora. I was a line soldier of the Yelth Protectorate, 3rd Levy, and I fought in the War of the Korrun Succession, which you have probably never heard of because it was a small war by galactic standards, a regional war, two neighboring peoples killing each other over a question of inheritance and border that had stopped mattering to anyone but us long before it stopped killing us. That is the thing about the small wars. They do not end when they stop mattering. They end when one side runs out of the young or both do. We were close to that on the Korrun Flats, both of us. We had been close to it for years. Let me tell you about the war, because you cannot understand the silence without the noise that came before it. The Yelth and the Korrun are kindred peoples. That is the cruelty at the root of it. We are not ancient enemies of different blood. We are cousins, two branches of the same stock, who diverged a few thousand years ago and built two nations on either side of a river valley, and then spent a generation killing each other over which branch held the rightful claim to the old throne that united us before the split. You would have to be one of us to understand how the closeness made it worse. We spoke nearly the same language. Our soldiers, dying in the mud, could understand each other's last words. We prayed to versions of the same gods. And we had been taught, both of us from the cradle, that the other branch was a corruption, a theft, a wound in the body of our shared people that could only be healed by the total defeat of the other. And so we fought not as strangers but as a family tearing itself apart, with all the special savagery that only a family can manage, because no one knows how to hurt you like the people who share your blood. I will give you the thing that taught me this, because I did not understand it as a boy and the war made me understand it in the worst way. In my first year on the line, I killed a Korrun soldier in a night raid up close, the way you did not want to do it, and as he died in the mud he said something and I understood it. That is the thing. I understood every word. He was not cursing me and he was not praying, though I had been told the Korrun did both at the end. He was calling a name in the old shared tongue, a name that exists in my nation too, that could have been one of my own cousin's names, and asking the name to forgive him for not coming home. I knelt in the mud over a man I had just killed, and I understood his last words as easily as if my own brother had spoken them, because his tongue and mine were the same tongue with a different accent, and the name he called was a name from my own family's naming, and I have never in my life felt anything like what I felt kneeling there. The understanding that I had not killed an enemy, I had killed a cousin, that there was no such thing as an enemy in this war, that we were one people who had been taught to call our own reflection a stranger, and had built a generation of corpses on the lie. I did not tell anyone that. You could not say it on the line. A soldier who said they are us was a soldier who would not fight, and a soldier who would not fight was shot by his own side. So I carried it, the way every soldier on both sides carried it, the secret we all knew and none of us could say, that we understood the last words of the men we killed, because they were our own words, and that the war was a family killing itself and calling it a cause. The Korrun Flats were the last of it, though we did not know that then. A wide gray plain of mud and reed between the two heartlands, fought over so many times that the ground itself was made of the war. You dug a trench, and you turned up the bones and the rusted metal of the soldiers who had fought there 10 years before, and you knew, digging, that in 10 more years someone would dig your bones up the same way, if there was anyone left to dig. The flats were always gray. Gray mud, gray sky, gray rain that never quite stopped. A cold, wet, endless gray that got into your spirit until you could not remember what color anything had been before the war. And the sound of the flats was the sound of the guns, not the great clean cannon of the stories, but the ugly grinding industrial sound of two exhausted nations throwing the last of their young at each other, the percussion of the artillery and the screaming of the wounded, and underneath it, always, the wet sucking sound of soldiers moving through mud that did not want to let them go. I had been on the flats for 2 years. I was 19 when I came up to the line, and 21 in the mud the day the human ship came, and in those 2 years I had watched everyone I came up with die. That is not an exaggeration for effect. It is simply the arithmetic of the third levy. We were the young ones, the late ones, the ones called up when the first and second levies had been spent, and we were spent in our turn, and by the day of the battle I am telling you about, I was one of the few of my original company still breathing. I want to tell you about one of them because everyone I came up with died is a sentence you can hear without feeling, and I cannot let you hear it without feeling. There was a boy named Edo who came up to the line the same week I did, from a town 3 valleys over from mine, and we became the thing you become in a war, which is closer than brothers and not by choice. You do not choose your war friends. The war assigns them to you by who happens to be in the mud beside you, and then they become the whole of your world, the only warmth in the gray, the one person who knows your mother's name and what you wanted to be before the levy took you. Edo had wanted to be a builder. He used to talk about it at night in the trench, in the cold, in a low voice so the others would not hear him being soft. He would describe the houses he was going to build after the war, in detail, the way the roofs would join, the kind of stone, where the windows would face to catch the morning, and I would lie in the mud beside him and listen. And for a few minutes the war would go away and there would be only Edo's houses, warm and dry and full of windows, waiting on the other side of the gray. He had it all planned. He knew exactly what he was going to build. Edo died in our second winter, not in a battle, which is the cruelest part, but to a sickness that went through the trenches because the mud was full of the dead and the water was full of the mud. He died slowly, over days, in an aid station that could do nothing, and at the end he was not talking about the houses anymore. He had stopped talking about the houses weeks before, and I think that is the moment I actually understood the war, not when men died in front of me in the killing, but when I watched Edo stop describing the houses, watched the war take the houses out of him before it took his life, so that by the time he died there was nothing left in him to build with. I sat with him at the end. He did not say anything I can repeat as a last word. He was past words. But I held his hand in the cold aid station, and I thought about the houses that were never going to be built, the windows that would never face the morning, and something in me that had still been a boy went out, quietly, the way Edo went out and did not come back. That is the day my fear burned out, if you want to know. People ask how the fear goes in a long war, and I have given the general answer. That fear is exhausting and cannot be sustained. But the true answer is more specific than that. The fear went out of me the day Edo died, because fear is a thing you feel about a future you still want. And when Edo stopped describing the houses, I stopped having a future I wanted, and a man with no future he wants has nothing left to be afraid of. I no longer expected to be breathing for long, and I had stopped, somewhere in that second winter, being afraid of it. That is the thing the stories do not tell you about a long war. The fear goes, not because you become brave. Because fear is exhausting, and you cannot sustain it for 2 years, and eventually it burns out and leaves behind a gray thing that is worse than fear, a kind of patient waiting for your turn, and I had that gray thing in me the day the ship came, and so did every other soldier on that field on both sides. We were all just waiting for our turn. The whole war had become a machine for using up the young, and the young had stopped expecting anything else. We were a generation of boys who had all, one way or another, stopped describing the houses. Now I have to tell you about the galaxy, because we were not alone in it, though the war had made us forget that. The Yelth and the Korrun were both minor peoples of a quiet corner of the Assembly of Worlds, members, technically, citizens of the great galactic body, though the Assembly had touched our lives so little that most soldiers in the mud had never seen an offworlder and thought of the Assembly, if they thought of it at all, as a distant rumor, a thing that happened to other, grander peoples. The Assembly had a rule about wars like ours. It did not intervene in the internal conflicts of member peoples, a principle of non-interference, the Assembly called it, the idea being that a people had the right to settle their own disputes without the great galactic powers reaching down to impose a peace. It sounded wise, that principle. It sounded like respect. What it meant in practice was that the galaxy watched the Yelth and the Korrun feed a generation of their young into the gray mud of the Korrun Flats and did nothing, for years, because doing something would have violated the principle of non-interference, and the principle mattered more to the Assembly than the dying did. We were left alone to destroy ourselves, and the leaving alone was called respect. I have thought a great deal in my long life about that word. Respect. There were off-world observers sometimes. I saw them once from a distance, a delegation of the Assembly come to monitor the conflict, standing on a rise above the flats in their clean clothes with their instruments, watching us die and recording it, and then leaving, because watching and recording was permitted and helping was not. I remember the rage I felt, even through the gray numbness, seeing them up there, clean and dry and respectful, observing the slaughter of a generation as though it were weather, a natural process not to be interfered with. They were not cruel, those observers. That is what I have come to understand. They believed sincerely that they were doing the honorable thing, the humble thing, refusing to impose their will on a sovereign people's internal affairs. And from up on the rise in clean clothes, with the dying at a respectful distance, it probably did look like honor. It is always the people at a respectful distance who can afford to call leaving by a pretty name. Down in the mud, where the distance was zero, we had a different word for being watched and not helped, and the word was not respect. But no one down in the mud had a voice that reached the rise, and so the word that stuck was theirs, and the galaxy went on respecting us all the way to the edge of our extinction. The humans were newer to the Assembly than we were, and stranger, and they had a reputation that had reached even us, even in the mud. We had heard of them. The hard ones, some called them, the ones from the killing world, though we did not fully understand what that meant. What we understood was that the humans were strong, that they had come into the galaxy not long ago and made themselves felt, that they fought in the Assembly's hardest places, that they were a people you did not want to find yourself across a line from. And we had heard, too, that the humans did not much like the principle of non-interference, that they had argued against it in the Assembly's great chambers, that they kept asking in their blunt human way what the point of a galactic civilization was if it would watch a people bleed to death and call the watching respect. We had heard that. We had not thought it had anything to do with us. We were a small war in a forgotten corner. We did not imagine that anyone, least of all the frightening far-off humans, was paying attention to the gray mud of the Korrun Flats. We did not know that somewhere, on a scarred warship, a human captain had been reading the observers' respectful reports, the clean recordings made from the rise, and had been doing the thing the observers never did, which was to look at the numbers in those reports and see, instead of a sovereign internal process, a generation of boys who had all stopped describing the houses. The battle I am telling you about began at dawn in the rain, and by midday it had become the worst thing I had ever been part of, which is saying a great deal. We had known it was coming. That is a thing I should tell you, because the waiting for it was its own kind of horror. For weeks the signs had been there, the reserves moving up, the supply trains running day and night, the officers tighter and quieter than usual, and we on the line had read the signs the way soldiers do, and we had understood that the high command was preparing one of the big ones, a great push, the kind that empties the rear and feeds everything into a single day. And we had understood, too, In the gray, patient way we understood everything by then, that most of us would not survive it. There is a particular silence in a trench in the nights before a great battle, when every man knows what is coming and no one says it. We did not talk about the battle. We talked about small things, deliberately, fiercely. A card game, a rumor about better rations, someone's complaint about his boots, building a little wall of ordinary talk against the thing we all knew was coming. And behind the wall each of us was alone with the knowledge that the dawn was carrying our deaths toward us on a schedule the High Command had already signed. The night before the Korrun Flats, I lay in the mud and I did not think about my own death, which I had made my peace with, but about Edo's houses, the ones that would never be built, and I thought, there are 10,000 boys in this mud tonight, on both sides, and every one of them had houses he was going to build. And tomorrow the High Commands are going to spend all of those houses to move a line on a map that will move back next season, and the galaxy will watch from the rise and call it respect. That was the last thought I had before the dawn that began the battle. It was not a brave thought, but it was a true one, and I have never found a truer one since. It was meant to be a decisive battle. Both sides had thrown everything left into it. The Yelth High Command and the Korrun High Command each having decided, in the cold way High Commands decide, that one more great slaughter might finally break the other and end the war on favorable terms. So they emptied the reserves. They sent up the last of the young, all of them, both nations, onto the Korrun Flats in the gray rain, and we met in the middle. And we killed each other in numbers that I cannot make you understand because the numbers stopped meaning anything past a certain point. By midday the flats were not a battlefield anymore. They were an abattoir. The lines had dissolved into a churning mass of killing, Yelth and Korrun, so intermixed that the artillery on both sides had stopped firing for fear of hitting their own. And so it had become a close thing, a hand-to-hand thing. Two exhausted peoples butchering each other in the mud with nothing left but the butchering, no strategy, no honor, no point, just the machine of the war using up the last of the young in a single gray afternoon. I lost the men around me one by one in that churn. I will not list them. I listed Edo, and that is the one I can bear to give you. The rest are in me, but they are not for telling. And by the early afternoon I was alone in the killing. The way you become alone in a thing that size, surrounded by thousands and utterly alone, which is the truest description of a great battle I can offer you. It is the loneliest place a person can be, a place so full of people that you cannot find a single one who is still yours. My line broke in the early afternoon. I do not know how else to say it. The Korrun came through us, or we broke and ran into the Korrun. I genuinely do not know which. It had stopped being the kind of battle where you could tell. And I found myself down in the mud, my weapon gone, my company gone, the killing all around me, and a Korrun soldier standing over me with his blade raised. I want to tell you about his face because I would see it again, later, in better circumstances, and because it is the face that taught me the whole truth of the war in a single second. He was young. Younger than me, I think. He had the look of a first year, the look I must have had over Edo's Korrun cousin 2 winters before, the look of a boy who has not yet had the houses taken out of him, who is still terrified, who has not yet burned through to the gray patient waiting. And he looked through the mud and the blood almost exactly like me. Not similar like me, like a cousin, like the thing we were. We had the same bones, the same color under the grime, and if you had cleaned us both up and put us side by side in the old shared tongue's clothing, no one in the galaxy could have told you which was the Yelth and which the Korrun, because there was no difference, there had never been a difference. The difference was the thing 2 governments had invented to have something to spend us on. I looked up at this boy who was my own reflection holding a blade over my throat, and I was not afraid, because the fear had burned out with Edo a year before, and I waited for my turn. And I remember thinking, with the strange clarity of a man who believes he is about to die, he understands me too. When I say something at the end, he is going to understand it, the way I understood his cousin. We are going to understand each other perfectly, this boy and I, in the second he kills me. That is the whole war. Two people who understand each other perfectly, killing each other anyway because they were told to. And then the sky went dark, and the rain stopped, not stopped falling, stopped reaching us, because something vast had come between us and the sky, and the Korrun soldier standing over me looked up, and his face changed, and I followed his eyes upward and I saw it. A human warship coming down out of the smoke. And I have to tell you that the stories are wrong about that moment, all of them. Every version I have heard since, because they describe it as the arrival of a savior, and it was not. When that ship came down out of the smoke over the Korrun Flats, no one on that field thought we are saved. Every soldier on both sides thought exactly what I thought, which was a single cold certain thought, the last thought of a dead man. Now even the galaxy has come to kill us. The ship was the most terrible thing I have ever seen, and I want to describe it properly, because the terror of it matters to what came after. It was vast, not the largest ship in the galaxy. I have since learned, a mere warship, a single vessel, but to us, who had never seen anything bigger than our own crude aircraft, it was a thing out of a god's nightmare. It came down slow, deliberate through the smoke of our dying, and it blotted out the gray sky, and the air itself changed under it, the pressure, the sound, the wet, heavy stink of the battlefield, all pressed down by the sheer mass of the thing descending. It was scarred. That was the detail I could not look away from, even certain I was about to die. The human warship was covered in the marks of old battles, scorched and patched and dented, a ship that had been to terrible places and come back, and somehow that was worse than if it had been clean and perfect, because it meant the thing descending on us knew exactly what it was doing. And every soldier on the Korrun Flats stopped. I need you to understand what that was, because it is the thing the title of this story is built on, and the title gets it almost right and the meaning entirely wrong. The battlefield fell silent, truly silent. Tens of thousands of soldiers, Yelth and Korrun, locked in the worst slaughter of a generation-long war. All of us stopped at once, weapons half raised, hands at each other's throats, and looked up, and the silence came down over the flats like a second sky. The artillery had already stopped. Now the small arms stopped, and the screaming dropped to a murmur, and the only sound left on that whole gray plain was the low building roar of the human ship's descent, and the wet patter of the rain that had begun to reach us again at the edges. The Korrun soldier standing over me lowered his blade. Not in mercy, he had simply forgotten me, forgotten the war, forgotten everything except the vast scarred thing coming down out of the sky, the way you forget your own small life when something too large to comprehend enters it. We all thought the same thing. I have spoken to others since, Yelth and Korrun both, and we all thought the same thing in that silence, that the galaxy had finally tired of our small, ugly war, and had sent the frightening humans to end it the simplest way, by ending us. We thought the ship had come to fire. We thought we were about to watch the Korrun Flats and everyone on it, both nations last young, erased in a single galactic judgment. And the strange thing, the thing I have never been able to fully explain, is that a part of all of us, I felt it, and others have told me they felt it too, a part of all of us was relieved. Because if the galaxy ended us, the war would be over. The gray machine would stop. The using up of the young would finally stop, even if the stopping was our deaths. That is how far gone we were on the Korrun Flats. We looked up at a warship we believed had come to annihilate us, and under the terror in the deepest place, some of us were grateful. The ship did not fire. It came down lower and lower, until it hung directly over the center of the battlefield, over the worst of the killing ground, close enough that the wind of it flattened the reeds and rippled the standing water and tore at our clothes. And still it did not fire, and the silence stretched, and the not firing became its own kind of unbearable, because a ship that vast hanging that low over a battlefield and not firing was a thing none of us had any way to understand. And then a voice came from the ship. It came from everywhere, from the ship itself somehow, vast and clear, and carried across the whole plain so that every soldier on the flats heard it at once, and it spoke. And this is the first thing that broke us open. It spoke in our language. Both our languages. The Yelth and the Korrun tongues, which are nearly the same and not quite, and the voice spoke them both, weaving between them, so that every soldier on that field heard the words in the dialect of their own cradle. The humans had learned our languages. Both of them. A small forgotten people's two nearly identical tongues, and the humans had learned them before they came, well enough to speak to us each in our own. And the voice said, "Soldiers of the Yelth, soldiers of the Korrun, this is the assembly warship Tertium Non-Dabiter, and I am her captain, and I have not come to fight you. I have come to ask you to stop. I am going to tell you something, and then I am going to give you a choice, and the choice will be real, and it will be yours, and whatever you choose I will honor. But first you are going to listen, because I have come a very long way against the rules of my own assembly to say this to you, and you are going to hear it before another one of you dies. I have to stop here and tell you about the captain, because she became the center of everything and the galaxy remembers her wrongly. Her name was Captain Imani Akafar, a plain human name, she said, nothing grand, and she was not what any of us expected the commander of that terrible ship to be. When she came down from the ship, later on foot into the mud, she was small. Human small, which is small by our standards. A compact graying woman who walked into the worst killing field on our world in a plain uniform with no weapon drawn, and stood in the mud among the dead and the dying of two nations, and looked at us, at the actual soldiers, the actual young, the mud and the blood and the broken boys of the third levies, with an expression I had never seen on any commander of my own people, which was grief. She looked at us, and she grieved openly, the way the humans grieve, and she had come down into the field to do it where we could see. But that was later. First there was the voice and the thing it told us and the choice it gave, and I will tell you both. What the voice told us was the truth about our war, the truth that both our high commands had spent a generation hiding from the young they were spending. The voice told us that the war of the Korrun Succession was over, had been over, in every way that mattered, for years. That the question of inheritance it had been fought over had been rendered meaningless long ago by the very length of the war. That there was no longer a throne worth claiming or a victory worth having. That both our nations had bled themselves past the point of any possible gain. And that the only thing still being decided on the Korrun Flats was how many more of the young would die before two exhausted governments admitted what they already privately knew, which was that neither could win, and neither could stop, because stopping meant being the one who admitted the whole generation had been spent for nothing. The voice laid it out, plainly, in both our tongues, the thing we soldiers had all felt in the gray waiting and never been allowed to say, that we were dying not for a cause but for the inability of two prides to be the first to stop. And then Captain Imani Akafar gave us the choice, and the choice is the thing the title calls total victory, and the title is right that it was total, and wrong about whose victory it was. Here is what I am offering, the voice said. I am one warship. I have the power hanging here to end this battle by force, to destroy both your armies where they stand, and I want you to understand that I could, because the offer I am about to make means nothing if you do not believe I had the other option and refused it. I could end your war the galaxy's old way by erasing the ones still fighting it. I am not going to do that. Instead, I am going to give you something your own governments could not give you, because they were too proud, and the galaxy could not give you, because it called its cowardice respect. I am going to give both sides the same thing at the same moment, so that neither of you has to be the one who stopped first. I am going to give you permission to live. Permission to live. I have turned those 3 words over for the rest of my life, and I am still not sure I have found the bottom of them. But I will tell you what they meant on the Korrun Flats that day, because the meaning was not abstract. It was the most practical thing anyone had ever offered us. The voice explained it. Captain Akafar had not come alone, and she had not come without authority. She had come, it turned out, having spent months doing the thing the Assembly's principle of non-interference forbade, which was paying attention to a small, forgotten war. She had gone to both our governments in secret before she ever came to the Flats. She had sat with the Yelth High Command and the Korrun High Command separately, and she had gotten from each of them the same private admission, that they could not win, that they wanted to stop, and that they could not, because the first to propose peace would be destroyed by their own people for having spent the generation for nothing. Each government was a prisoner of the war's own logic. Each would have stopped years ago if it could have stopped without being the one who stopped. And so Captain Akaffer had done the thing neither could do for themselves. She had arranged for both to stop at the same instant, by the hand of an outside power, so that neither bore the shame of it. She would descend on the battle. She would order both armies to lay down their weapons. And both governments had secretly agreed, in advance, to obey, to be seen to be forced, so that each could tell its people that they had not surrendered. They had been compelled by a galactic power against which resistance was impossible, that the dying had stopped not because either side gave in, but because the humans came down and made them stop. It was a fiction. The whole thing was a fiction. The humans gave both our prides a story they could survive. We did not lose. We were stopped by a force beyond us, and both governments took the story gratefully, because the story let them do the thing they had wanted to do for years and could not, which was to stop killing the young. Captain Akaffer's terrible warship, her vast scarred machine, her power to annihilate us all, that was never a weapon aimed at our armies. It was a weapon aimed at our pride. She made herself into a force so overwhelming that surrendering to her was no shame, and then she let both sides surrender to her at once, and called it her victory so that it did not have to be either of theirs. Humanity claimed total victory. That is what the histories say, and it is true, and it is the most generous thing anyone has ever done for my people. The humans claimed the victory, took it onto themselves, so that neither the Yelth nor the Korrun had to be the loser. They won our war on purpose so that we would not have to lose it. The voice gave the order. It told every soldier on the Korrun Flats to lay down their weapons, that both governments had commanded it, that the war was over by the authority of the Assembly and the power of the ship overhead, and that anyone who continued to fight did so alone against the galaxy for nothing. And there was a silence after the order, a long one, the longest of my life. And I lay in the mud and looked up at the Korrun soldier who had been about to kill me, and he looked down at me, and I watched him do the arithmetic that every soldier on that field was doing at the same moment, the arithmetic of whether to believe it, whether to be the fool who lowered his weapon and was killed for it, whether the thing he wanted more than anything, which was to stop, was real or a trick. And then he dropped his blade in the mud. And he reached down, this Korrun soldier, this cousin, this boy who looked like me, who had been a breath from opening my throat. He reached down and he offered me his hand, and he pulled me up out of the mud, and neither of us said anything, because there was nothing in either of our nearly identical languages that could hold what was happening. And all around us, across the whole gray plain, the same thing was happening, soldier by soldier, the weapons going down into the mud, the hands reaching out. 2 nations worth of the young discovering all at once that they were allowed to stop, that someone had given them permission to live, and that the permission was real. I have to tell you what the Flats sounded like then, because I told you at the start about the sound of the war, and you should have the sound of its ending. It was not cheering. I have read accounts since that described cheering, and there was none, not at first, because we were too far gone for cheering, too emptied out by 2 years of gray waiting to have any joy left in us that quick. The sound of the war ending was weeping. Tens of thousands of soldiers, Yelth and Korrun together, standing in the mud where they had been killing each other a minute before, weeping not from joy and not from grief, but from the release of a thing held too long, the gray patient waiting for your turn finally allowed to break, and it broke as weeping, a whole battlefield of the young weeping in the rain because they had just been told, by a voice from a terrible ship, that they did not have to die today after all. That is the sound of the Korrun Flats falling silent. Not silence in the end. Weeping. The sound a generation makes when someone finally lets it stop. Captain Imani Akafor came down into the mud after that. She did not have to. She could have given her order from the ship and left. But she came down, on foot, into the killing field, small and graying and unarmed, and she walked among us, among the dead and the dying and the weeping living of two nations, and she grieved with us openly, and she helped. That is the thing I remember most. The commander of the most terrible machine I had ever seen knelt in the mud of the Korrun Flats and helped our medics with the wounded, Yelth and Korrun alike, her hands in the blood of a people not her own. And when one of my company, a boy named Tesso who did not survive the day, asked her through the translator why she had come, why the humans had broken their own galaxy's rules for a small, forgotten war that had nothing to do with them, she said a thing I have carried ever since. She said, because somebody was supposed to a long time ago and didn't. The whole galaxy watched you bleed and called the watching respect. We don't think watching is respect. We think it's just a nicer word for leaving. And we've been left before by people who could have helped and called it respect. So when we got strong enough to be the ones who help, we promised ourselves we'd never call leaving by a pretty name. That's all. Somebody should have come a long time ago. We're sorry it took so long. We came as soon as we were strong enough to come. The war of the Korrun Succession ended on the Korrun Flats that day, and it has never resumed. That is the part that still amazes me, all these years later. It did not flare up again the moment the ship left. The peace held because the peace was built on the one thing that could hold it. Both peoples allowed to believe they had not lost. Both governments freed by the humans' claimed victory to do the rebuilding they had secretly wanted to do for years. The Yelth and the Korrun are not united. The old wound did not magically heal. But we do not kill each other anymore. The young of both nations grow old now. They dig in the ground of the Korrun Flats and they turn up the bones and the rusted metal of my generation, and they do not add their own to it. And that is the only victory that was ever worth having, and it was total, and the humans claimed it so that we would not have to lose it. I am an old Yelth now, older than I ever expected to be, since I was a dead man at 21 who was given permission to live. I have spent my long extra life trying to understand what the humans did on the Korrun Flats, and the closest I have come is this. The galaxy thought the humans were strong because they could destroy. The Korrun Flats taught me that the humans were strong because they could decline too. Anyone strong enough can win a battle by erasing the enemy. That is the oldest and cheapest kind of strength there is. It takes a far rarer strength to hold the power to erase, to hang it visible and terrible over a battlefield, and then to spend it instead on giving two broken peoples a way to stop without shame. Captain Akafor could have claimed her total victory the easy way in fire and been remembered as a conqueror. She claimed it the hard way in mercy, by taking our defeat onto herself so that we could keep our lives and our pride both, and she is remembered by those of us who were there as something the galaxy has no good word for, a victor who won a war in order to give it back to the people who had lost it. The histories say a human warship descended into the battle, and the battlefield fell silent, and humanity claimed total victory. Every word is true, but the silence was not fear, and the victory was not ours being taken from us. The silence was a generation realizing it was allowed to stop. And the total victory was this. Not one more of the young had to die to prove a point that two prides had been too ashamed to drop. The humans came down and dropped it for us, and took the shame of the dropping onto themselves, and called it their victory and flew away and left us alive. That is the kind of strength I did not know existed, the day I was a dead man in the mud. I know it exists now. I have spent 50 years alive because of it. And when the young of the Yelth ask me what the humans are really like, the ones from the stories, the terrible ones with the scarred ships, I tell them the truest thing I know, which is that the most frightening thing about the humans was never what they could destroy. It was what they could have destroyed, and chose not to, and the mercy they were strong enough to spend instead.